Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is May 7, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure today to be with Mark Stahlman. Where in the heck you calling in from, Mark?
I'm calling in from a converted firehouse where my Center for the Study of Digital Life is headquartered and where I live in Jersey City, New Jersey.
How cool is that? The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
The best thing for a human being is to understand what it means to be human.
Very good. I like that you laughed first, too.
Which we have largely forgotten what that means. And we're actually now in a very serious conundrum because we've progressed very far down the road in trying to generate artificial humans. That raises massive questions about what it means to be an actual human. So I'm very honored to be on your podcast based on your own activities over decades and also many other people who you've invited on. So I'm in exalted company here today.
Geez, Mark, no one ever says that. I'm super honored. The second question is, really, thank you. What is your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Right. Well, I'm going to object to the use of the term information.
Yeah.
It is a very deliberately meaningless term.
Yeah.
So you're familiar, I'm sure, with many aspects of the notion of a meme. And the term information is a meme. It is meaningless.
Yeah.
So what do? We take the word and we unpack it. And obviously the root of information is form.
Yeah.
And it's actually the way you pose the question. What's the most important form of information? So I consider information to be a deliberate obfuscation of the meaning of form. So it prefixes and it suffixes the term form, which is where we really need to focus our understanding. And in particular, as Marshall McLuhan and his son Eric made very clear, we must recover formal causality. So we don't just need to understand forms, but we got to understand how forms cause things to happen.
Yeah.
Now, by the way, as I'm sure you know, certainly as Joyce knew very well, Joyce being a follower of Thomas Aquinas, as was Marshall McLuhan. By the way, I don't know if you've attempted to review the author of a recent book on Joyce on exactly this question, the upbringing of Joyce and how Aquinas is so critically important to understand, particularly Joyce's early works. I know you've spent a lot of time on Finnegan's Wake, and by the time you get to Finnegan's Wake, Joyce has been subsumed to a larger degree than his early work by the environment, technological environment in which he lives, the psycho-technological environment. So he begins to reflect radio and ultimately television in the Wake, and he's pulling from the telegraph most importantly. So Joyce has really been drawn into the electric paradigm.
Yeah.
Never experienced what we're now experiencing, but we have been disarmed by that previous paradigm. I'm 75. You're a little bit younger than me, I think. A couple of years.
70,
maybe.
Yeah. 70, 5 years younger. Yeah.
Right. So we're in something close to the same cohort. We grew up with lots of the same influences.
Yep.
Those influences have driven us into a highly fantasy-driven world. And there is no room for forms in a fantasy world because you're making it up as you go along. So, as I'm sure you know, and as Aquinas and so many others would have asserted, the form of a human being is its soul.
Yeah.
But if you insist for various reasons to eliminate and actually deconstruct and eviscerate an understanding of the soul, then you get yourself into a pretty nasty cul-de-sac, and that's where we are today.
Yeah.
In the West, and we'll get into this probably in some greater detail, but humanity is at this point quite fragmented, and so the question, what does it mean to be a human, requires you to be a little more specific.
Yeah.
In terms of what kind of a human.
That's good. Mark,
so,
let's hold there for a second, because just to go back, the upbringing of Joyce, you were going to say the name of this new book that tackled.
Fran O'Rourke is the author of the book, and I'll look up the title of it. But
that's all right. I didn't get the name of the author. Just tell me the name again.
Fran O'Rourke.
Oh, Fran O'Rourke. Okay, but here's to go back, and that was brilliant what you just taught me, and I appreciate it. Very articulate. Is you grew up, it was not what's the most important form, it's what's your favorite form of information. So you went into that word, and this is what my series is really about, is me and you versus the wording on the questions. So I like when people adjust the verbs or say, I want to adjust this word, that you pose the question. But I'm assuming you grew up a reader. So you one of your favorite forms growing up of acquiring knowledge or content or memes or whatever you want to call that was probably reading.
Well, as it turns out, and I'm not sure how often this occurs to you, but I think my preferred form of learning turns out to have been my father.
Your father, so you mean spoken word?
Yeah, yes, yeah, that is correct. I did not read his PhD thesis. I did not read his other essays until much later in life. Well, so we were collaborators of a sort.
That's perfect, because I would say, what's your favorite form of information? Is my direct experience with my dad. That's an amazing question, because people usually take it too literally. I'll tell you, Craig Baldwin, great filmmaker, I says, what's your favorite form of information? And he said, human touch. Now, most people don't say human touch is information. Dan Magnuson said, hug. So this was good. You went into it. But why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Well, let me rephrase in the way that I was suggesting earlier.
Yeah.
Which changed the question to become, why do human beings assemble forms? Why do we recognize forms?
Yeah.
And that, by the way, is a subconscious activity.
Yeah.
Most people think of information as a very conscious activity. Yeah. And most people think of gathering or collecting as having a serious conscious component to it.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about conscious activities here at all.
That's perfect. But let's do this. Is this need or want to assemble forms, this tendency to assemble forms, more innate or more invented?
Oh, it's absolutely innate.
Yeah.
It is absolutely hardwired. This is actually the part of the nervous system which is material. There are areas in the brain responsible for this.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, today's psychology, cognitive psychology, which models human beings on computers, understands none of this.
Right.
And this compounds the problem, because if we're going to model human beings on computers, and computers simply don't have the same form, there's no soul.
Yeah.
in a computer. So if you've eliminated the soul, or in Greek, psyche,
Yeah.
so psychology is the study of the form of living creatures.
Right.
And it's
Let's,
not just humans that have souls,
yeah.
everything that's alive. So this is the distinction between alive and never alive.
And never. Mark, you're anticipating like 5 upcoming questions. So we'll
Okay.
get through them, and you can elucidate as you are so well. Do thoughts create emotions?
No, thoughts and emotions are quite different things.
Fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I.
Well, I prefer the McLuhan quote.
Yeah.
I will see it when I believe it.
I'll see it when I believe it. Yeah, that's well, Marshall also said, I don't know what I think until I say it. And Joan Didion said, I don't know what I think until I write it. So when say Marshall's again, when
I will see it when I believe it.
I'll see it when I believe it. That's good.
Okay, so let me amplify on
Go
that.
ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
It turns out that Marshall McLuhan had a very close associate, probably the person who helped him the most in writing his PhD thesis, which, as you know, was awarded in '43 from Cambridge University, classical trivia. So I'm always interested when I study somebody, as I have McLuhan, and I'm sure you've spoken about McLuhan on many of these interviews. I'm always interested in the first things they wrote.
Yeah.
And their earliest influences. And it turns out that there was a gentleman at St. Louis University, Bernard Muller Time.
Yeah.
So we will abbreviate that in this conversation as BMT, which,
Yep.
as you might recall, was once the name of a subway line in New York City. And BMT wrote some very important essays in the 40s when McLuhan was composing his PhD thesis.
Yeah.
And I think helped him, in fact, in doing this. And this was pointing McLuhan in a direction that unfortunately he never completed. So we have enormous respect and interest for Marshall and many others, but we also have to recognize that the time in which they lived didn't afford them the same experiences we've had. In particular, Marshall McLuhan's experience with computers was next to nothing. And now we live in a world that is, in many ways, being run by computers. So we sort of have to update what Marshall said about this. But my go-to location for the McLuhans, plural, where Eric and Andrew are all very important parts of this. I never knew Marshall. I would have called Eric a friend, and we were in regular touch. And I have drafts of various things that he's written that he asked for my advice on. And he was actually a fellow at my center, which we'll get a chance to talk about in a minute. Andrew was a fellow today. So I feel very close to the McLuhans as a family. But the place I go to try to answer these sorts of questions is the laws of media.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you've taken a look recently at the laws of media tetrad on computers. As you recall from what Eric wrote in Laws of Media, of the 4, retrieval is the key to the entire tetrad. Without retrieval, you would wind up with some or another version of a triad, not a tetrad, and that would probably fall into, and many actually McLuhan scholars have made this mistake, trying to reduce the tetrad to a triad in order to introduce sequence.
Yeah.
Now, McLuhan, of course, knew because McLuhan didn't have a modern sensibility. His profession was to deal with modern poets and other artists. Joyce, Eliot, Lewis, and Pound are the four that normally get mentioned. So we call that JELP, J-E-L-P. So his English professor job had him dealing with JELP, but that was not his sensibility. Remember, McLuhan did a very big job to keep himself out of himself personally, with one important exception. And that exception, that exception was Renaissance magazine. The only magazine that he sat on the board of, the only magazine where he contributed. I think the last count I had was 40 or 45 contributions, and the only publication that has been systematically ignored by McLuhan scholars. So you'll wind up with the interior landscape without a single essay from Renaissance reprinted. And you will wind up with a bibliography that has a handful of essays when there were more than 40.
Wow.
And so there's a huge chunk of McLuhan, which is the Aquinas Catholic chunk, that tends to be left out or recognized and then passed by or obscured and so forth. And that's why I brought up the recent book about Joyce. It's Joyce and Aquinas, and McLuhan and Aquinas. And the whole question of applying Aquinas. Joyce, as again, you're the Joyce scholar here, not me, but Joyce, I think I read this on one of your websites, that Joyce described his work as applied Aquinas.
Right. And people said,
and
which is,
and indeed, so has Bernard Muller-Time, the associate of McLuhan. And in fact, there's a New York Times obit for BMT, in which he was one of the key people who started the firm McKinsey, the consulting firm, management consulting firm. And he's the one who introduced Marshall to Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker being probably the person who first wrote about the development of management science. And so one of Marshall's mentors, BMT, was after he got into a academic fistfight over Aquinas, he stepped into the fan of Aquinas scholarship face first, and effectively got drummed out of the business because he criticized Mortimer Adler and also Jacques Maritain, and was forced to publish. This is Bernard Muller-Time now, mentor to Marshall McLuhan. He was forced to publish apologies and then effectively left the field. Where did he go next? He left St. Louis, came to New York, and he was one of the key people who founded this massive firm, McKinsey and Company. And so in that obit, New York Times, online, anybody could find it. They remember the name. He says, all I was doing was applying Aquinas to management science. So I would say, in a certain sense, all that McLuhan was doing was applying Aquinas.
Yeah. That's good, because he was applying Joyce. Yeah, that's funny. He copped the form again. He copped, I'm going to do this applied kind of gig.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, this is good. we read Laws of Media out loud with a group of people like we do with the Wake now. And we've been doing this for over a year. So I'm glad you brought up Laws of Media. So many, well, a lot of McLuhanites don't do Finnegan's Wake at all. They sort of diss the tetrad, or they chalk it off. Anyways, I'm really honored that you're articulate about this. Say it again.
I actually got Derek de Kerkhoff to address that question
at
a conference in Toronto.
Yeah.
And he was quite emphatic. No, I never use Laws of Media.
Yeah.
That's not McLuhan.
I know. Yeah. So anyways, we have a commonality here that's really rich and it's bubbling. Okay, let's keep going with it, because as the questions go, you can go into these amazing talks and teaching sessions for me. Can humans think without language?
No. Not in the sense in which we would now describe thinking.
Yeah.
And language, of course, we have no idea what the origins of language really are. Noam Chomsky thought it was such a big deal that he, I believe he did, hypothesize a mutation or multiple mutations relatively recently, somewhere, say, around 50,000 years ago. But my guess is that thinking, which is, if you will, a function of the intellect, as human beings have developed, I will not use the word evolve because I'm a biologist, and once upon a time I actually studied evolution. And so biological evolution is not the right application here. The human beings evolved biologically far before this, but the development of spoken language, and even more importantly, written language, should be very closely associated with what we now think of as thinking. Thinking about thinking.
Thinking about thinking. That is, boy. Chomsky says the language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do, Mark, when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
I turn the television set off.
That is great. You're implying you always have it going on. Is this,
no,
you mean?
No. The only circumstance in my life where language breaks down is either television or those who've been influenced by television or who want to be on television. It is television as a medium.
Yeah.
That has generated what John Vervaeke calls the crisis of meaning.
Yeah.
So when language fails, it probably fails because somebody's trying to manipulate you.
Wow.
And
all right.
You've had a highly eclectic, often very exciting, I'm sure, career. And you're a tough guy to manipulate.
Mark, you're my friend, man. You're saying things I need to hear. I'm a tough guy. I'm a Pollyanna, mamby-pamby. But I love to take that on, and I believe what you said is true. But I also am easily manipulated because I grew up in front. Now, this is an important thing you just said. I grew up in front of a TV. I can't read. I'm like one of those people who can't really read. I can read about reading. Like, I'm not a Joyce scholar. I'm a Joyce student. And what do I end up reading is Finnegan's Wake. Well, it's an unreadable book, so it works perfect. And in fact, it goes along with McLuhan saying this. You can tell me if it's true. I've repeated for years that when people our age went to college, they didn't have TV so much, so they took LSD. And that was it. That was like, well, turn the TV off. They turned the TV off and started taking acid because it was like the substitute or the retrieval of the TV experience. So,
well, let me actually amplify that a little bit.
yeah,
I have a number of small pointed hats that I wear, I guess, in public.
yeah,
Another public exposition. But the LSD is ancient Greece.
yeah,
Well, that most people don't understand that. So let's explore that a little bit. It turns
please.
out that the only culture that I am aware of which required everybody in its to be a part, to literally not be banished, was Athens, Greece. And what they required of people is that they attend the mysteries of Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries, which were based upon an organic version of LSD. So we have to ask ourselves when we look to the Greeks, what is going on here?
Yeah.
We can read books, and there's dozens, hundreds of them about the paideia of ancient Athens, and people continue to this day to write these books about all of these Greeks, forgetting that they all took LSD. And in particular, what they got from the mysteries of Eleusis was a very keen sense of immortality.
Yeah.
And that's what LSD does to you. This is a reason why Tim Leary took the Tibetan Book of the Dead with him,
Yeah,
to Millbrook, New York,
yeah,
and conducted the sessions as if you had psychologically died and were being reborn.
yeah,
So this death rebirth experience is very different from mescaline, very different from psilocybin, very different from heavy doses of cannabis or whatever. It's unique as far as I know, and I know a little bit about the subject.
yeah,
In fact, so it turns out that television is a pathway to illusion. The television set itself, if you look at the technology involved, you will see that the raster scan television technology is actually a illusion machine. It's a deliberate illusion machine.
yeah,
So you growing up in front of an illusion machine
yeah,
keyed your life into a wide variety of illusions.
yeah,
And you've been experimenting with illusions for much of your life, I would guess.
yes. And you nailed it in this article you wrote with the 3 other people. So it's credited to 4 people. There's some references that blew my mind. And one of them, there's a line that says, is TV real?
Yeah.
And that is a line I've repeated for years because Corla Pandit said that. And I was just curious, just an aside really quick, where'd you get that line, is TV real? Do you know it's just made up, or did you read Corla Pandit saying it?
No, I did not read anybody else saying that.
Yeah.
But I've been in my writings and interviews and so forth over many, many years, I have been trying to draw people's attention back to reality.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the very earliest things that probably appeared with my name on it on the internet was a very early blogger. And the title of the piece, you can still find it if you Google it. And it would be Let's Get Real.
Yeah.
So I've devoted much of my life to the promotion of reality over illusion. So that would be the origin of that quote. So
That's good. Let's go
I
up
did
on.
not grow up in front of a television set.
Do you know who Corla Pandit is, by the way?
I do not know.
Okay, look him up. Corla, Korla Pandit. He basically played organ on TV for 60 years and disguised himself as an Indian, as in classical India, and
Yeah.
he was really a black man. So it's an intriguing, and Zappa wrote one song all about Corla Pandit. But if you just give him 30 seconds on YouTube, you'll be alarmed on the guy who put him on TV in LA was a former employer of Hitler. He started KTLA. Anyways, here's the two questions. What you just said, Mark, brought up. Can you forget to die?
Can you forget to die? In other words, if you could accomplish that, then you won't die?
You're asking a question with a question. Mark, you win. That's what this is all about. Marshall, invent new questions and new metaphors. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is basically, again, you put the question in the context you want.
Okay. Well, my answer, can you forget to die, is that is precisely what LSD was meant to do.
Yeah.
To convince you that you wouldn't really die, but you would come back.
Yeah.
So much of the world's religion is continues to this day to circle around the topic of reincarnation. And so my best answer is you cannot forget to biologically die.
Yeah.
But you can certainly convince yourself you're coming back.
Yep. It's good. That's Paul Krasner says, I only believe in reincarnation in one of my past lives.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Is perception reality?
Well, perception is our link to reality. It is not the same as reality. And here is where the key element of illusion and memory come into play. So it turns out for us to move forward, time does have a arrow. There is a future, there is a past. And so for us to move forward in our understanding, we're going to have to abandon the psychology which is dominant today, called cognitive psychology, which patterns humans on computers. And we're going to have to return to what used to be called philosophical psychology. And that approach to psychology obtained more or less everywhere in the West, remembering here that the East is radically different, and we'll get into those differences at some point. Yeah. But effectively, there is no soul, even though there are various words in various Eastern religions that could be equated. There is nothing that really lines up with what Aristotle meant by psyche, or what the Greeks more broadly meant by psyche. But in Western psychology, and by the way, when the first work of Western psychology was translated into Japanese and into Chinese, what the translator discovered, the title of the work was Philosophical Psychology, written in the mid-19th century. And so as the explorers, colonialists, imperialists, however you wish to describe them, by the time they got there, there was no word for psychology. And so just starting with the title, the translator had a serious problem. I once gave a presentation in Tokyo at a conference called The Logistics of Sensory Design. You will notice the initials. It was quite deliberately meant to be the LSD conference. And as it turns out, I didn't notice before this, but there was simultaneous translation, and I kept using the word fun. And then I was told by the translators, there is no word in Japanese for fun. So there's many, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what the translator told me. There are many aspects of global civilizations that simply don't line up. They cannot be matched.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, the psychology that we now need to embrace is called faculty psychology. And the key faculty, which in Latin is known as the via, the road, cognitiva. It turns out that not cognitive, but this ability to, in fact, perceive relationships and forms, that is hardwired into us. And that is where percepts are transformed, as McLuhan would say, into precepts.
Yeah.
So we are constructed in such a way that we must be able to identify these forms. And in fact, human memory is the key faculty for assembling and storing. And then the cogitative sense, which has almost entirely been forgotten. In fact, many people who wrote in great detail about this after the printing press, importantly, left the cogitative sense out. And so we've had hundreds of years now of misunderstanding of the human psyche.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
We're not going to let that continue. And the robots are forcing us to go back. We are now retrieving a scribal, or if you want, medieval sense of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
This is probably the single most important thing happening on Earth today, more important than artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Human beings remembering what it means to be human.
Yeah. Mark, let's hold for there, because I want to go back. Donald Thiel said something I repeat all the time. He said, Marshall teased people to believe his percepts were concepts. And then you just said percepts and precepts. Were you saying basically that precepts and concepts are sort of the same? So it's either percept. So basically, what's the difference between? I know. I mean, I get a feel.
My answer to the question, may he rest in peace, and I knew Don Thiel quite well, is that he is 100% unreliable on Marshall McLuhan.
But you wouldn't agree that teasing.
Very careful quoting Don Thiel.
Yeah,
he hated Marshall.
But don't you think that's sort of accurate? He teased people to believe his percepts were concepts because he was in academia and he was in introducing new questions and new metaphors. And in academia, you have to introduce theories and concepts.
He had no theories. He had no.
I know that's why I'm saying Thiel is saying he teased people to believe that.
No. That's not what he was doing at all.
Yeah.
What Marshall was doing, in my view, and I'm I guess a bit of a McLuhan scholar.
Yeah, I would say
he was trying to find people who had already figured it out. He wasn't trying to add concepts to anybody. He was trying to probe them.
Yeah.
To figure out if they had already put two and two together.
Yeah.
And so there was certainly a stimulus, a stimulating activity, but he found that to be almost impossible. So, as you recall, McLuhan tried and failed to get financing from multiple sources. He succeeded, but I think really because he was tagging along. The Ford Foundation grant that launched his career was not given to Marshall McLuhan. His partner in that particular crime had a much more important reputation. And as an anthropologist, had a much higher standing.
You mean Edmund Carpenter?
Yeah, Ted Carpenter.
Yeah.
He's the one to whom that grant was given by the Ford Foundation.
Yeah.
Marshall was along for the ride.
Yeah.
Marshall was an unknown at that point. He published and then rejected his own Gutenberg Galaxy, Folklore of Industrial Man. He had no standing in the larger community.
Yeah.
He couldn't compete with Margaret Mead for that grant.
Yeah.
So throughout McLuhan's life, and as you know, this is the way the biography, the first biography was written, was that one way to understand McLuhan's life is that he was always looking for money.
Yeah.
Big family, big house, big monthly nut, as we would call it today. And so he was looking for somebody, preferably with money, who would support his efforts.
Yeah.
And that was a very unfulfilling activity. And to some extent, he self-sabotaged that whole scheme. But he was, the way I like to put it is, he was pushing a rock up a hill.
Yeah.
We're not doing that anymore.
But he could have been, I mean, I'm a mamby-pamby Pollyanna. He could be like Zappa saying, I'm a failure, but I'm not a miserable failure. You know, Marshall seemed to have a good time. Don't you think he had? I mean, I know Mary Jane Schultz, who I wish you could meet and talk to. You know, she hung out with Marshall at the Bahamas, and she's in that book, Who Was Marshall McLuhan?
Yeah. And
she's one of the, you know, many people who give you 2 pages of their experience with. And she had a good time with Marshall. And, you know, Mailer would send his books to her before they were printed. And she had relationships with all these thinkers. And she talks about Marshall's having a good time. And she's sort of turning him on to feminism. But Mark, could we just go back for a second? What's the difference between precepts and concepts?
Right. Well, remember, the first term is percept.
Percepts is what he pursued. Perception. Well, studying.
Well, he took it beyond that to precept.
Yeah.
And because Marshall's understanding of psychology was truncated, he was absolutely pointed in the right direction. But here's how I would draw distinctions. Percepts are, if you want, are 5 external senses.
Yeah.
Precepts are our 4 internal senses. And concepts are the intellectual result of that whole process. So percept, precept, concept, they are not the same.
Yeah, yeah. Very good. That really nailed it. Are humans, your observations of us in general, are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
Neither.
Very good. You know what I get. 80 to 90% say this is how they say it. I think we're more feeling beings. This is 80. Now go ahead and respond. Neither. And go.
So, among many things that Marshall shared, and this is turning out, as I expected, to be sort of a Marshall McLuhan oriented interview, and that's great.
Yeah.
As you recall, Marshall repeatedly said, the action is in the gap.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So in terms of the human psyche, where is the gap?
Yeah.
It's not percepts. It's not concepts.
Yeah.
It's the gap between percepts and concepts.
Yeah.
And that gap in between are the inner senses.
Yeah.
And
what's
Marshall,
another word? What's another word for inner sense?
The word that most people would use to describe this is subconscious.
Subconscious. Okay. Go ahead.
So when I say subconscious, I deliberately do not use the term unconscious.
Yeah.
Remembering here that unconscious is a German term, and doesn't designate relationships. It just simply says it's not. So unconscious is not conscious, if you will. But there is I believe there is a temporal and, if you will, psychological hierarchy in the human soul, in which the perception, which is our encounter, our experiential encounter with reality, and then our conceptualization, which is very often rationalization, as it turns out, associated with the intellect. Well, what's in the middle of the sandwich? Where's the meat in all of this?
We call it the chewy caramel center.
That's it.
The chewy.
Or there was this commercial I'm reminded of now, and I'm thinking that I'm going to revive that commercial, in which this older lady comes on and takes a look at a fast food sandwich. She says, "Where's the meat?
Where's the beef?"
Where's the beef?
That's good.
So it turns out that beef, forces a lot of uncomfortable activities on you, and trying to come to grips with it requires that you discard modern psychology, patterning humans on computers. Computers don't have a subconscious. Computers don't have a soul.
Yeah.
So if psychology says there is no psyche, then there's no beef.
Yeah.
We are now in the process of rediscovering the beef.
Does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're more so detecting it or more so creating it?
As I have mentioned, Aristotle, who effectively invented psychology, was very clear that all living things have a psyche. So, if you wish to attribute consciousness to all psyches, then there's all kinds of consciousness running around. A cup of coffee does not have consciousness, but the fly that's buzzing around your head does, if that's how you wish to think about this. But let me underscore the following. Consciousness has only become such an important topic that it would arise at this point in my interview with Jerry Fialka, because why do we care about consciousness so much? And as opposed to all the rest of what goes on.
Right.
And because consciousness is not the meat in the sandwich.
It is not.
It's not the beef.
Yeah.
It turns out that the only reason why we are so obsessed with consciousness as the, quote, hard problem is because we want to make artificial humans.
Yeah.
So we've come to the
Whoa.
conclusion that consciousness is what humans do. So we must figure out how to artificially create consciousness so that we can create artificial humans. So the whole topic of consciousness, much like the whole topic of information, is coming from a bad place.
Well, that's that, Mark. Hold it. That's making a value judgment. Wouldn't you say it's not coming from a bad place? Like applying suspended judgment, understanding is not having a point of view. What's another word you could say? It's coming from what place?
I'm absolutely agreeing with you.
Yeah.
And so I will withdraw the statement. It is coming from a destructive place for humanity.
Yeah. There you go.
And yes, you can decide on your own, dear listener.
Yeah.
If replacing human beings with robots is good or bad.
Bad. Yeah.
But,
and this is again the services and disservices, because how do you flip a disservice into a service? But Mark, I just have to repeat a Marshall line after you saying that and get your thoughts. Marshall said technology is the most human thing. So inventing a golem or a Frankenstein monster or a chatbot, isn't that the most human things humans will do? That's not destructive. We're just extending ourselves and using imagination to be inventive. So
unfortunately, imagination is exactly the wrong thing to use.
Good. Okay. So again, I withdraw my statement. Respond to that's very good. Marshall saying technology is the most human thing. To what you just said,
Sure.
how would you respond to that? Yeah.
At some point, we don't know when, prehistorically, human beings invented spoken language. That is a technology.
Yep.
At a later point, which we can actually pin down in timelines, human beings invented a wide variety, just as they invented a wide variety of spoken languages, they invented a wide variety of written languages. Language is a technology. Easy enough to figure out because when you're born, you don't have it.
Yeah.
So all the things which we have acquired, all the paintings on the wall behind you, all the clothing we wear, and the rest, these are all technologies. We invented them, and yes, that begs the question of why would human beings not be satisfied just being another mammal?
Hello.
but obviously we're not. And so some people would characterize this of we're smarter than the chimpanzees. Well, that is the way that a recent lecture that I watched said. So what happens when something smarter than us comes along? If the distinguishing characteristic of humans is that we're smarter than chimpanzees, we're obviously weaker. So we shouldn't be alpha in that particular biological configuration. So again, the same error is made. We're smarter.
Yeah.
Now that is foolish. That's not the point.
Yeah.
And in fact, something much closer to that would be we are the animal that is constantly trying to transcend ourselves. Chimpanzees do not seek to transcend themselves. So it is this urge for transcendence.
What's another word for that? Transcendence. To suss that word out a little more.
Well, I guess straightforwardly, it would be there's got to be more about reality than the material aspects which are around us. A
Yeah.
chimpanzee can sense the material world
Yeah.
and react to it appropriately. So immateriality.
Yeah.
There's more than the material.
Non-physical?
That then becomes the human urge to transcend the material.
That's the non-physical?
Yeah.
The non-physical. Yeah. Yeah.
But not non-physical in conversations that we've been having. So um, it's tucked away at the bottom of your website. I don't mean to belabor this, but as you
Yeah.
know very well, a fellow who calls himself Bob Dobbs, his real name is Bob Dean, but a fellow who calls himself Bob Dobbs has adopted the phrase non-physical.
Right. Yeah.
But that was not the direction I was planning.
That's not the direction you were going. Okay, but non-verbal, would you say? We can leave it at immaterial.
Immaterial, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. You're explaining it well. I didn't mean we're trying to transcend. That's what you suss this out. Technology is the most human thing. I like what you said. Let's go on. Unless you were completing a thought and I'm cutting you off, let's go on because we'll circle back around a lot. Yeah. I appreciate this, Mark, a lot. Really appreciate it. Okay. 2 questions from Alan Turing. You've already answered them, but I got to ask them anyways. 1950s. 1, is thinking a function of the soul?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In particular, thinking, as we would normally refer to it, is a function of a faculty of the soul.
Yeah.
And that faculty is generally described as intellect.
Yeah.
But that is, if you will, that's one side of the bun, one side of the sandwich.
Yeah.
It's not the beef.
Way to go. Beautiful metaphor. The second Turing question is, can machines think?
No.
Okay, let's move on because you've covered it.
No, thinking is the faculty of the soul. Machines don't have souls.
Yeah.
And so if you eliminate the soul, which more or less has happened in our lifetimes, there's there are probably some people you've interviewed who could actually explain to you in their own experience, particularly musically, in terms of soul music, which of course is church music. And so attributing thinking as a faculty of the human soul to a machine is idiotic.
Yeah. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I actually spend most of my time trying to gather people around me who are, and around themselves, trying to build a functioning social collective. So I'm a bit personally a Pied Piper, I guess, in that regard. And I do get a great deal of satisfaction and even happiness from both succeeding and failing in doing that. But I will confess on my own behalf that I get a great deal of happiness from recognizing forms.
Right.
And in particular, I have somehow figured out how to harness an aspect of my subconscious to do that. So there are many things that people have done with their subconscious. Obviously, psychoanalysis and so forth is all a part of that. And then there's Gestalt psychology and so forth that try to avoid doing that. But The truth is that I can write essays in my sleep.
Yeah. Well, Viktor Frankl said in Man's Search for Meaning that happiness doesn't necessarily last and meaning tends to last longer. That's where I got that question, basically.
Right, right.
What's faster, Mark, the speed of light or speed of thought? I'm glad you laugh after every. You're like, George Carlin's daughter. She said it so. She would take a big, deep yoga breath, then laugh, or maybe the other way around, then answer it. That's
right.
what this what it's all about, is laughing.
So the answer is thought has no speed in the sense that you've described it.
Yeah.
And so the speed of light is a mathematical formula, and mathematical formulas such as speed of, velocity, mass, momentum, and so forth, these are physics questions. Humans are biological creatures. And so there's very often, and Viktor Frankl would have been caught up in aspects of this, because in his days, the confusion between physics being fundamental and biology somehow having to live on top of physics, I think we have to very seriously reevaluate that. In particular, it occurs to me that we are now going through a massive paradigm shift. And as you recall, the term paradigm it's based on a Greek word, paradigma, but it was introduced into our modern vocabulary in a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And Thomas Kuhn published that book first in 1962. So it has just recently had its 50th anniversary. As it turns out, the way you can tell, if you couldn't subconsciously otherwise figure it out, that you're in a paradigm shift, is when science throws its hands up in the air and says, I really don't understand what I'm doing here. And that has happened everywhere. There isn't a single science that I'm aware of that hasn't self-consciously, in its own terms, come to the view that maybe we have not been looking at this right. I'll give you a physics example. In particular, a cosmological or astrophysics answer. There is very serious doubt now about the theory of the Big Bang by astrophysicists. And the reason for that is simple. We have finally built a telescope strong enough to look far enough back in time to see that the predicted distribution of galaxies, black holes, and the rest does not match with the Big Bang. Evolution. It has come to people's attention that we truly do not understand the time scale and pace. It turns out the fossil record does not support Darwin. A whole bunch of things all happened more or less at once for reasons we don't understand. So somewhere at the core of both biology and physics, those who are involved in those fields have started to say, wait a minute, we might have to rethink the whole thing. That's what a paradigm shift looks like from a standpoint of a scientist.
Rethink.
We're now in the middle of one.
Yeah, Mark, beautiful. At the end of their lives, Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart were actually talking on the phone. And they both had watched the PBS documentary on the Big Bang. And Frank asked Don Van Fleet, who's Captain Beefheart, they said, what came before the Big Bang? And Don went, the big. And another rock hero, George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic.
Yeah.
He has a song where he goes, "Brother, can you pair a dime?"
I wondered where that phrase came from, because I tend to throw it around, but
Well, that's where I got it. I mean, he could have got
from
it.
Clinton.
Yeah, he could put somewhere else. But
Well,
that's funny. But
did you ever run into the band Digital Underground?
oh yeah, that guy is brilliant. Yeah, that he just passed away about a
Yeah,
year
Humpty
ago.
Hump. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, they were somewhat more contemporary for me, and so while I have listened to a fair amount of George Clinton,
yeah.
I've listened to more of Humpty Hump and the Digital Underground. But I should note here, not to go off on a tangent,
Yeah.
but Zappa was also quite important in my early development. I almost remember riding my bike down the hill from my parents' house. I would have likely been in junior high school. Maybe actually high school. The Mother's Invention double album, which was the first Zappa album, that appeared in '66, right?
It's somewhere in there, 66, 67. I don't have it memorized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I graduated high school in '66. So my guess is that it came out, I'm just going to make this up, summer of '66.
Yeah.
But in any event, back in those days, you could go into a record store and they would have listening booths.
Yeah.
And so you would go to the latest record bin, and you take the record, go in, put the headphones on, and it had just arrived a couple of days before that. I walked out with Mother's Invention, the double album, when it first appeared.
Beautiful. What an influence. It is amazing. But Humpty Dump, or
Well, you knew the man, of course. I mean, you were
I
you were
worked for
part
Frank.
of his whole entourage and activities. You were
I
active
worked.
part of Frank Zappa world.
I worked for Frank for 10 years or 9.5 years. And I actually did the longest interview ever with George Clinton, or one of them. But the funny thing about Digital Underground, again, this is about words, what we're talking about, grammar, rhetoric, just how you put words together. Digital Underground, he taught me through some interview that one of George's hits, Flashlight, can be interpreted two ways. One is flashlight as a noun. You use a flashlight,
Right.
or it's a verb and you're commanding flashlight. You know, you're the light, now flash. And I was like, this is what opens me up talking to people like you and them, where it's endless possibilities, you know.
So, are there multiple meanings for the famous Digital Underground song "Sex Packets"?
I will Google it later, and I don't know. I haven't.
You haven't listened to that song lately?
PACKET packet.
Yeah. Sex Packets, right?
No, I'll definitely look it up. But back to metaphorically, what's faster, speed of light or speed of thought? You really handled it well. But I'm just saying, your sort of playful guess, if you had to commit one way or the other.
My answer is, if it's important to be fast, human thought is faster.
That's good. Here's Audre Lorde, poet. You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools.
Mm-hmm.
Her colleague, Yvonne Rainer, said, you can if you expose the tool. What new tool do you suggest?
I've already mentioned it. It is the critical link between percepts and concepts, and it's the cogitative sense. We all have it, but we have suppressed it.
Yeah.
And we have suppressed it in favor of imagination, in favor of creativity. And so what we need to do is remember the forms in our life. And this is the tool that Marshall was looking for when he probed. He was trying to find people who could do that, not very successfully. There's a number of other folks that I've treated as mentors who have had similar experiences. So my statement would be, under television conditions, which we have both grown up under, we have allowed that tool to atrophy.
Yeah. What's another word, Mark? What's another word for the cognitive sense? Just
not cognitive. This is very important. Cogitative.
Sorry, what's another word for that?
For the cogitative sense. The cogitative sense is a subconscious faculty where we recognize forms. So it is form recognition. It's very important
form recognition. That's really is good. But I gotta just counter.
It's important to distinguish this from pattern recognition.
Wow. Okay. Before
Machines can recognize patterns, but they can't recognize forms.
Yeah. Amazing. But Mark, why would you say we've suppressed it with imagination? Because can't humans use imagination to recognize form
No, they can't.
They can't. Now, why is that?
Imagination. So I will just quickly describe this and give your viewers a reference if they care to. It turns out that Aquinas, who has come up earlier in the conversation, it turns out that Aquinas's main work, I guess, is called the Summa Theologica. And at an early part in that work, which can be found online, Aquinas Summa Theologica, it has 4 books, but book 1, Article 78, so it's not the first thing, but it's right there on the initial list. Question number 4, are the interior senses properly distinguished in the standard English translation? The interior senses are 4-fold, according to Aquinas, and there was much debate about this, by the way, in those years. A lot of people tried to figure this out. But Aquinas' version of this, which winds up being Joyce's version of this, which winds up being, to some extent, McLuhan's version of this. By the way, Joyce had a partial Thomist education, as the book by Fran O'Rourke will indicate. He probably did not read Summa Theologica. He probably read Summa Contra Gentiles, because the author actually figures out there wasn't a copy in Ireland of an English translation. He could have read it in Latin, but he wasn't, but maybe. But in any event, the 4 are the common sense, which brings together all of our perceptions.
Yep.
Memory, which is where we store images that we have taken in through the common sense. So that means there's a persistence. And it happens in the material part of the lower brain. This is not happening in the cortex. And then there is the cogitative sense, which is where we recognize forms. And what was described as memory is the place where those form recognitions are being stored. So there are 4 separate faculties, and philosophical psychology needs to retrieve these. As you may recall, in Laws of Media, under the heading of computers, as we've already discussed, the most important of the 4 tetrad quadrants is retrieval.
Yeah.
And so if you were to go to the retrieval quadrant of computers in Laws of Media, you would see there were actually 3 published tetrads on computers, but the best one is the one that's published in the McLuhan book, and the answer is memory. So it turns out that memory of forms, including timelines associated with it, This is the most important aspect of our subconscious. This is what needs to be deeply strengthened, and what living in a television world, surrounded by illusions, surrounded by everybody telling you your imagination is the most important thing. It is not. Everybody telling you that you have to be creative. That's not the most important thing. It is important.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to eliminate imagination or creativity by any means, but if it is unbalanced, if it does not have these other capabilities built into it, you're in big trouble. And that is the world we live in today.
Yep.
We're in big trouble.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you can articulate that and not, it doesn't feel like you're scolding us. You're saying, hey, get on board and let's do this. Let's use this tool.
Well, I'm actually taking it another step. What I'm saying is you will have no choice in the matter.
You have no choice. That's it.
What happens is a technological environment. We're exiting the television environment. Television environment gave us no choice.
Yeah.
We had to do imagination. We had to be Disney Imagineering. We had to have Fantasyland. That was absolutely necessary. As the technology drove us, we're not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
You know that the kids don't watch television anymore.
Yeah.
You know that the kids, particularly what's called Gen Z, which is a marketing term, they have absolutely left that stuff behind in a surprising measure. But the next generation, which tends to be called the alpha generation, and then the beta generation. So these are small children and the not yet born. They are going to reject overblown, unbalanced fantasy big time. And it won't be their choice to do that, because they will look around and they will see their peers are doing it. They will see there's been a massive change in media that accords this. So the paradigm shift, which we are now living through, in this sense, is a shift from imagination to memory.
Yeah. Well, you've anticipated some. Let's ask you this, Mark, for a second. I usually do 90 minutes. And can you go longer, or do you want to end in 90?
No, I can go as long as you want to.
Okay.
But at some point, it might make some sense to describe how I'm trying to make all this stuff happen. What do I do every day?
Right. Well, this is what I would foresee. Let's go for another 30, 40, 50 minutes and then do a part 2 or part 3, because there's two things that's happened here. One, no one's ever come in 40 years basically and said thank you, or complimented me. So that was very nice of you and very encouraging.
It's the truth. If you go to your website, that's some really fascinating stuff there.
No, and I appreciate that. And then number 2 is usually in 90 minutes, when I do a part 2, I've gotten through 20 or 15 to 20 of 40 questions. Normally I do 40. I've gotten to number 6 and we're almost at 90. and I can't interrupt you like, hey dude, make your answers shorter because it's just too rich. What new toy do you suggest? You said you talked about this tool so well and you articulated, and we can go into how we're going to do that. But let's say, what new toy do you suggest?
Well, I'm actually having a lot of fun playing with Chat GPT.
Oh, are you really? That's good.
Oh, yeah. Now, you go to Jerry Fialka's various websites, you're going to see a lot of fascinating artistic expression, some very interesting and accomplished people, but you're not going to see much discussion about technology.
Yeah.
And so I think that you might want to reconsider some of that. But ChatGPT is beginning the process of being described as being sentient.
Yeah.
And famously, a Google engineer said that online, later got fired. He probably was a interesting fellow in many ways, so I'm not sure he should have been working there to begin with. But the ChatGPT today has so complete as a toy, and anybody can use it. You just go to the OpenAI website, and then you go into the Playroom, and it's right there. So they're treating it like it's a toy.
Yeah.
And I just find it fascinating, the sort of stuff that it comes up with.
Yeah.
And over the next few years, the toy is just going to get more and more fascinating.
Yep. Indeed. In fact, at our awake meeting the other night, we said the guy typed in, "What does this page mean?" And it said, "Well, you can't figure it." It was a pretty good answer. And then I went on to a rant about how a lot of people really don't want chatbot to be, as happening as it is. And I said, get over it. It's just another tool, and we got to deal with it.
Woo. It's not just another tool. There's no such thing as just a tool. They're all extensions of us.
Right.
And so the question then becomes, well, what is that extension? What are we extending?
What is it extending? Exactly. But to make the point, it was basically, they said, okay, I'm going to type in, what does Jerry Fielka think about technology to chat? And it basically said, oh, he thinks it has services and disservices. And it was just like, it's just, to me, it's like Google a little better, but I know it's deeper, and I'm happy for the people who are exploring it. And I'm shocked that I haven't used it yet, but friends of mine have used it. And I'm glad you're giving me this feedback that you're having fun with it. Okay, Mark, what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Getting up in the middle of the night to pee. I'm not sure what the best answer is.
That is the answer. That's the joke. The guy goes to the doctor and he says, "Doctor, I'm having trouble peeing." He says, "How old are you?" He says, 80. He says, "You peed enough." But that's the right answer. There's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions. Mark, that one you got right. Okay, McLuhan learned from Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. Right. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions so that we might be able to cope with what we don't like about the inventions. So I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Right. First part of the answer, obviously, is that art is the beef in the sandwich. It is the subconscious.
Yeah.
And the reason why artists are the antenna of the race is because they have the capacity to bring into the light effectively what we're already bouncing around amongst our inner senses. But the reason why we avoid that is probably best summed up in Marshall's repetitive use of the figure-ground relationship.
Yeah.
And as you know, or may have seen, his library, of course, is at Rare Books in Toronto, and it's filled with marginalia. So he would write in the margins, and F divided by G, figure and ground, is one of the more common things that Marshall wrote. And when he did that, I believe what he was mostly trying to tell us is that the passage he's relating to has not yet figured out that difference. The quote that I would use, again from Marshall, so this may not be something that has been at the top of your McLuhan quotes. There's so many of them. In May of 1969, Marshall wrote a letter, which is in the published book of letters, to Jacques Maritain. Jacques Maritain was probably the Catholic theologian who was closest to McLuhan's own views. And Maritain had just written a book about being a peasant of the Garonne, French River. And Marshall was responding to that, complimenting him on the book. And then 3/4 of the way through, he says, there is a deep-seated repugnance in the human soul, or maybe human heart, which is another interesting question. Where is the soul located, if it's located any place? And the role of the heart, and as well as the brain, fascinating. So let's say deep-seated repugnance in the human heart against understanding the processes in which we're involved. Second sentence. Such understanding implies far too much responsibility for our actions. So, one version of this would be, if you really knew what was going on, you'd kill yourself. One version of this would be, you'd be terrified to get out from underneath the covers. But I think that Marshall, as usual, hit this nail squarely on the head. We don't want to be responsible for the world. We can complain about it. We can march down the street. We can put together a group of people and perform a concert. But if we really understood the processes that are underway, then we own them.
Yeah. Really well put, Mark. And let's go back to the figure ground marginal marking. You said, I missed it. When he put F/G, he meant he has not figured it out?
No, he meant that the author of that passage.
The author has not figured it out.
Has not sorted out the figure and ground that is being discussed.
Right.
And if figure and ground were brought in a competent way, the author wouldn't be saying what they said.
Do artists have moral obligation?
Well, you corrected me earlier about trying to stay away from moralizing.
Yeah.
And there are, in addition to there being, and I've drawn comparisons, but I'm not sure others would agree, 4 quadrants and 4 causes.
Yeah.
And of the 4 causes, as Eric made very clear, the formal cause is the one that really interested Marshall.
Yeah.
And the one that he thought was probably the most problematic was the moral cause. So I believe that should be translated into, if the artist adopts a moral or moralistic pose, then they haven't got the whole picture.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that moralistic statements should never occur, but if they do occur, they should occur along with all the others.
Yeah. Which
makes it very, very difficult, with formal cause being at the head of the list. So On Formal Causality is an essay written by Eric McLuhan. It's in a book published in 2011 called Media and Formal Cause.
Yeah.
I actually brought this up on a mailing list, which so upset the McLuhan scholarship world that a few of them, who really did not like what I was doing, decided they would get a bunch of people together and get a contract. And there is a book out there called Retrieving McLuhan's Cause that misses all of this. And that media ecology group continues to try to get at aspects of this. So other essays have been published since then. But if you're going to be moral as a form of causality, then you're going to have to adopt all the others as well. And you can't just think you somehow expressed outrage, moral outrage, and that is the end of the story. It's never the end of the story. So
Never.
If you're taking all four causes into account and putting them sort of in their relationship to each other, as McLuhan recommended, then you will wind up with something like the tetrad, which does not put moralization on the, that's not how you begin. You may wind up with aspects of that. So formal, efficient, material, and final causes all must be taken into account. And when somebody moralizes exclusively, they've lost the plot. They've gone off in the weeds.
Wow. Yeah, you nailed it right at the 90-minute point, Mark. You said it's not the end of the story. That's the name of the essay I'm writing right now. So there's something cosmic happening here. All right.
Right.
Thank you, Mark. Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Since retrieval is the critical quadrant,
Yeah.
in the tetrad, I'm not sure that we have many new ideas.
Yeah.
But instead, it's really sort of which ideas or which paradigm are you retrieving?
Yeah.
Now, to the extent that you wind up with a attempted retrieval of the oral world, which is what television does for us, these are very, very old ideas, archaic ideas.
Yeah.
And the transition from an oral world to a written world, a scribal world, was massive. That was absolutely huge. That's where civilizations come from. That's where so much about our lives came from. So we are now retrieving scribal, not oral.
Yeah.
And so we're retrieving old ideas and making them new again. And so it is that process of knowing which memory pool you're dipping your soup spoon into that becomes critical here. Because we now live in a digital paradigm, because the world is filled with people and institutions who wish to get rid of humanity and replace humanity with flesh bots to begin with, and then hardcore robots. It has become a very, it's become urgent in a way that it wasn't before, that we straighten ourselves out in terms of which ideas we're retrieving. And in the West, the ideas that we are increasingly going to be retrieving, I will guarantee you that around the world today, there are small groups of teenagers and 20-somethings who, particularly in the West, who devoted themselves to virtue. And so the retrieval of virtue, which is an old idea, right? There, depending on who you're talking about, there's a handful, typically identified as 4 cardinal virtues. But then, since the West is Christian, we then wind up with 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. So retrieving those virtues and, if you will, the ideas and the emotions and the forms associated with all of that, that has now become the task of the West. We will have a chance to discuss at some point how the East is way ahead of us and is not looking for virtues. Instead, the Tao or the way is what is now animating the East sphere.
Yeah.
And very importantly, at least in terms of what I do every day, as a result of these technological changes, we are now living in a 3 spheres world. The globalist world is gone. It's been replaced by 3 spheres: East, West, and digital. And each of those is looking for something different. The digital sphere wants to be immortal. Digital sphere wants to overcome all biological constraints. Digital sphere wants to replace humans with something more perfect. And in order to do that, it has to effectively retrieve alchemy.
Yeah. Wow.
So the East is retrieving the Tao. Little known, although it should be, today's senior leadership in China are Taoists.
Hmm.
And the reason for that is because of the close association throughout Chinese history between technology and Taoism. China could not be the technological powerhouse they are today if they were Confucian. It wouldn't
Wow.
work. So they had to become Taoist, looking for the Tao, which is a fluid, non-static. Many of your viewers will no doubt have read the Tao Te Ching, and they'll be very familiar with that and other Taoist books, which, by the way, today are now being taught all the way to the top of the Chinese Communist Party, which I just said wrong. There is no CCP. There's a CPC. The Communist Party of China is its name. And I have met people, professors at Peking University, who have become private tutors of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is effectively the cabinet in the governmental structure. They're being taught Taoism from the original texts. This has been going on for about a decade now, and it's all throughout the educational system. So we in the West are trying to retrieve virtue. The East is trying to retrieve the Tao, and the digital sphere is attempting to retrieve the spark of the divine, which, of course, if you're going to become immortal, you're going to have to become a god.
Boy, Mark, you packed so much in there. That was so well put. And I, again, appreciate how articulate you are. I wanted to go off on one little tangent here because the way I say it sometimes is there's basically 3. There's spoken word, printed word, and electronic word. So, spoken word could entail gesture. So if electronic, and I'm not saying I'm right or anything, I want you to teach me. Electronic word kind of started with the telegraph. That's where electricity is involved.
Right.
And that's where, if you look up social media, they'll say social media started with the telegraph. I'm like, social media is people talking. Like, no, this is what the term means. So, social media means electronic word telegraph.
If you remember, there was a commentator for many years. He's not with us anymore. John Perry Barlow. John Perry Barlow used to say the original virtual reality was telegraph.
Oh, did he? Yeah, that's, yeah.
In other words, you're having a conversation with a machine, with a
yeah.
What the hell is this? I actually visited Edison's home, which is now a museum.
Yeah.
In a small little gated community called Llewellyn Park by West Orange, not far from where I am in Jersey City.
Yeah.
And I found what the docents thought was probably an original to Edison. Most of the things have been curated and placed around the museum and so forth, but this was sort of in an obscure corner. And they said, chances are that's actually an Edison print.
Yeah.
And it was an angel flying through the air with the original telegraph message, which is a biblical message. What hath God wrought?
Oh, no.
Yes.
That's
Most people who may have heard that, and you can look it up. Obviously, it's many websites.
yeah.
Will give you the biblical reference. Many people consider that to be a question.
Yeah.
It's not. It's an exclamation.
Oh
What
my
hath
God.
God wrought? Exclamation point.
Okay, well, we got to go on this tangent for a quick second. That I know that line so well because it's in the middle of a Frank Zappa song called "The Adventures of Gregory Peccary," and he goes, "What hath God wrought?" So you're saying Edison said it as a statement, but
No, Edison bought a painting,
right,
a small little painting, and hung it on the wall in his study,
right,
and it remains to this day. If you were to go to the museum, it's still there.
and that version is a statement or a question. The Edison painting.
It's a statement. It's an exclamation.
Yeah, as a statement.
In the biblical reference, what hath God wrought is a biblical phrase, and it is an exclamation point. It's not a question.
Oh, it is. It's both places are saying it as a statement.
Yes.
And then it's morphed into a question over the years by misuse. Yeah. Okay, so this is a McLuhan question. And we got to go back to the 3, but before I forget, here's how I say it, and I don't know my source. Let me know if you've heard this. That Woody Allen exposes America to, Marshall and Annie Hall. And Marshall's question, do you mean my whole fallacy is wrong? That's a question he would ask.
Actually, I believe the statement was, you believe my entire fallacy is wrong. It was not a question.
Marshall's original way of saying it?
In the movie.
No, that's what I'm saying. In the movie, Woody had him say it as a statement, whereas Marshall previously usually said it as a question. So Woody exposed the world to Marshall backwards, which and then I always follow it up with, well, Marshall would say a half a truth is still a lot of a truth.
Right.
Now, have you ever heard that?
What I have heard is that Woody did not want Marshall McLuhan. He wanted
Buñuel and Fellini. Yeah.
And so Marshall was a last-minute pick.
Right.
What I've also heard is that Woody thought that Marshall had stole the show and was upset with him for ad-libbing on all of that. But no, I have not made the distinction between statement and question.
Question, yeah.
No.
Yeah. Anyways, I was just curious. So that's aside. And then there's that other book by that woman. And it says that Marshall had his 3 fingers down on purpose. Have you ever heard that?
Oh, Marshall absolutely posed for pictures with 3 fingers, typically of his right hand, resting on his thigh.
In what is that? In what regards is that?
That's the Trinity.
The Trinity. Oh my
Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.
That's great. Okay, now back to the other Trinity. Do you agree it's okay to break communication down kind of to spoken word, printed word, and electronic word? Or do you say digital is a fourth, or is digital an aspect of electronic? Because you can't have digital without electricity.
Sure you can. You can't have, in fact, you can't have a human being without electricity. But you don't need in electricity as it generated an environment that is not required for robotics. And in fact, there are plenty of power sources that can and have been developed. But an algorithm is not electric, it's digital. And so what you just asked is a very important question that deserves perhaps more time than we have.
Yeah.
But it is absolutely correct to say spoken word, written word, and electric word.
Yeah.
However, more distinctions are needed.
Right.
And in particular, the distinction that is often missed is the distinction between handwritten and printed.
Yeah.
And this is obviously McLuhan's Gutenberg galaxy. So McLuhan was quite well aware that written is not all one thing by any means, and that in fact print is what took us off into the weeds. And here's an important thing for you and your listeners to consider.
Yeah.
China is running circles around the West today. Why? And I believe the answer to that question is because they never got print. As it turns out, the fundamental technology that distinguishes East and West is alphabetic and logographic. Chinese logograms have meaning. They may also have some phonetics associated with it, but their origin and their, if you will, the form that is being recognized in Chinese writing is a form that is meant to have meaning. And as a result of that, it became very difficult to print. The alphabet, of course, has no meaning. It's meant to pattern on sounds, spoken language. And therefore, it became very easy to carve into wood blocks and metal and become printing. And so it was this most fundamental technology of all, technology that gave us civilization. Written, handwritten, scribal technology. That technology persists to this day as fundamental to China.
Yeah.
That is their advantage over us. When I first traveled to China in 1997, so I guess I've got 26 years of visiting, not every year by any means, but a handful of times. I was informed that the family, the high-ranking Chinese family that I was effectively going to work for in China, the patriarch of the family, when he retired to paint characters. This is a man who had been the Minister of Defense under Deng Xiaoping. He is the man who modernized Chinese military technology. And when he retired, he didn't retire with a soldering iron in his hand. He retired with a Chinese ink brush in his hand. If you go to the biggest bookstore easily accessible in middle of Beijing today, Wang Fuzheng bookstore at the end of Wang Fuzheng Street, which is sort of the main shopping street. The Apple store is a block away from what I'm talking about, for instance, sort of the prime retail real estate. You get in this bookstore and you will find an entire floor of the bookstore devoted to writing Chinese.
Wow.
This is what we are now struggling to remember. We're struggling to remember our scribal past. And so people collect pens, people collect pencils, people collect all sorts of things, as you know. Some of it, there you go, and you're being scribal in taking these notes as there we go. Good.
I'm on page 7 of note taking. Mark, this is amazing.
We need to remember how to do this. We need to remember our penmanship, and it's become known as calligraphy.
Yeah,
but I think the path forward is quite clear.
Quite clear. You made that so articulate, and you evoked an amazing phenomenon that Finnegan's Wake became a bestseller in Chinese a couple of years ago. I mean, it was like you go to Google News and you put in Finnegan's Wake, and all it would be was like 10 hits on how it was a bestseller. Now, this is phenomenal, in my opinion, because one, you can't translate Finnegan's Wake into another language because, first of all, it is 65 languages that already exist in one language that Joyce invented called Finneganese. So how in the heck do you translate it? And that's why learning from Marshall and people like you, etymology is very important.
Right.
And if you study where the word translate comes from, it comes from trader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how do you, but the beauty is, how did Chinese, Finnegan's Wake is poo-pooed by everybody across the world. And, Marshall admitted that he got a lot from it, but how could you translate it to Chinese and then have it become a bestseller?
I'm going to have to ask around some of the people that I work with who are knowledgeable about these sorts of things, but I'm going to hazard a weak guess.
Yeah, please.
And this is just the most fundamental observation of all.
Yeah.
Finnegan's Wake begins and ends with an ellipsis that is connected.
Yeah.
It's a circular discussion.
Yep.
My guess is that the people who have a problem with Finnegan's Wake are people who want things to be linear.
Yeah.
Or as Marshall would have perhaps phrased them, POBs, print-oriented bastards.
Yeah.
But that is this detour taken only by the West into the print era, which, among other things, which bothered Marshall greatly, it effectively destroyed the Catholic Church.
Wow.
And his interest in moving beyond print into electric had as a subtext the retrieval of the Catholic Church. And this is the aspect of McLuhan that generally gets me sidelined in a broader McLuhan conversation, but be that as it may. The Chinese have no interest in linear stories.
Yeah.
They are very interested in circular or cyclical stories. So just simply the idea that Finnegan's Wake comes back to where it began, that is a very Chinese way of thinking.
Sounds good to me, Mark. You explained it well, and you have some history with Chinese. I appreciate that. Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
I'll give you one of them. Probably is not the earliest one, but one that is relevant for this audience. What years did the television show Howdy Doody run?
Yeah. Well, it's a click away, but let's say Howdy Doody's probably late 50s.
No, it's earlier than that. It's earlier.
Early 50s?
Early 50s, I think, yeah. Early
Okay.
mid. But be that as it may.
Yep.
It is a click away. I remember taking my brother's, I guess, crib playpen, which had wheels, as they often did, so you would move it around the apartment. I remember putting his crib in front of Howdy Doody because it terrified him.
I thought you were going to say to share the laughs, because you're the older brother by how many years?
I'm 2 years older. And so I tortured my brother with Howdy Doody.
Can you and him laugh about it now, or does he hold it against you?
Yeah, we can. I probably did worse also, but the standard older sibling, younger sibling rivalries and jealousies and so forth. I'm sure I committed many crimes against brotherhood, but that's one I remember.
Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Well, it must be both, and the blessing probably has to. Right now, I think people consider it to be a curse, but I believe we're heading into a rebalancing situation in which we rebalance imagination positively. So we emphasize the services of memory because it's been abandoned, and we emphasize the disservices of imagination. Now, as you know, services and disservices need to be balanced and are indeed distributed wherever we look. But since we've gotten so out of balance, we are deeply in need of a rebalancing.
Deeply. Mark, in regards to memory, I'm doing a project on archiving. Like,
okay.
Hopefully you have all your papers and books and whatever valuable things you've created over these years going to some sort of archive so that the future people can study them. And this idea of preserving a legacy, is it innate in humans or invented? It's just, I'm going to throw out a lot and you can go wherever you want. Wyndham Lewis said, basically, artist, let's just say everybody, live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. So, Ram Dass, be here now. Why is it so important, not the evident, studying history, that we preserve or remember anything? Why don't we just live in the moment and move forward?
This is exactly the point of the cogitative sense.
Yeah.
If we are going to, and Ram Dass would be a fine example, he is a television era imagination guy who would absolutely have that point of view. And I will jump ahead and say the obvious here, which is I'm not going to argue with him about that.
Yeah.
This is not a matter of it's quite appropriate for the time in which he lived and the experiences that he had. It would absolutely not the way you want to work today. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
That rebalancing requires you to, in some sense, live in the future. When I was on Wall Street, I remember one day I had to read these publications like Wall Street Journal and so forth. And so there's an Investors Business Daily. I think it's still around, IBD.
Yep.
And they had a very strange article in which they said, some people, most people, in fact, live in the past. A great deal of people, the second largest group of people, live in the present, and they tend to be women. And it tends to be linked to children. It becomes very difficult to live in the past when you have children, when you're responsible for children. And then the article said, and then there are some people who try to live in the future. They often tend to be men. They often tend to be businessmen, because they're trying to figure out what comes next. I have apparently some talent and my career on Wall Street. So if you were to look at LinkedIn for me, you would say, oh, I get it. He's a Wall Street analyst. And indeed, that was my career before I retired. I'm not a Ivy Leaguer. I'm not a MBA. I'm not a typical Wall Streeter. I don't wear brown shoes. As we both know, brown shoes don't make it.
You're good, Mark. You're good. You mean you're like Reverend Al. You didn't sell out. You snuck in.
I did sneak in.
There you go. Very good.
And I snuck in because, as people on Wall Street would say, I don't know what it is, Stahlman, but you seem to be able to see around corners.
Yeah.
And that is what I would describe as form recognition.
Yeah.
So apparently I have some talent in doing that. So I bet my career twice. I would have been fired and working at the car wash or something or other. I bet my career twice on companies that nearly everybody on Wall Street, not everybody, were convinced were total frauds, would go out of business in the next month or next quarter. America Online and Sun Microsystems. If investors had placed $1,000 bet at the earliest time and held it, they would be 100 millionaires over for the appreciation for these stocks, companies that were thought to be just total losers. So I snuck in under the tent, got on Wall Street, bet my career, and it worked. And then I did it again. I actually met with the team at Sun Microsystems and the management of my own company. I walked out of that meeting. My boss, multiple levels above me, but the president of the company, had a rough time with the Sun Microsystems management. They came public in 1996. And I'm sorry, 86, came public in 86. 92, I took AOL public. But in 86, I was a nobody. I just arrived. People were trying to figure out whether I'd survive. They knew I was different. And in fact, I walked out of that meeting with the president of the firm I was working for. And he said, Mark, I am very sorry. I've totally wasted your time. This is a piece of shit company. They're not going to survive at all. And I now owe you one. You get to ask for anything you want from me. I'm the president of the company. What do you want? And I said, that's easy. I want to cover the company and I want to recommend that everybody buy it tomorrow. He said, okay, that's what you want. And that was the first leg that my career on Wall Street got to stand on.
Wow.
AOL came along later. But yes, recognizing forms and their relationships to each other is now become mandatory because of artificial intelligence, because of Chat GPT. We can't look at that and say, great, now we can see everything that's going to happen in the future. Sign me up. Or we can't look at that and say, well, that's garbage in, garbage out, doesn't actually know anything. It just is a token generating system. Get the next word. What's all the fuss about? Of course, those are both figure responses. Those are not ground responses. Yeah. The ground response to ChatGPT, AI more generally, is, okay, this will change everything.
Yeah.
And in particular, it elevates the question, what does it mean to be human?
Yeah.
In a way that could never be done. There's no megaphone large enough. to get people to ask that question seriously in a ground basis.
In a ground.
What is the ground of humanity? We can no longer avoid that question. And in the process of answering that question, we will discover the services of digital. Just services are somewhat overblown and to some degree irrationally assigned. As we know, social media is just, as McLuhan would have told us, this is just television as the content of a new technology. Everybody becomes a broadcaster.
Yeah. Let's see. He morphed the global theater or the global village into the global theater. Like
correct.
Yeah. So Mark, you touched on so many things. I love to play with words. So FG, figure ground. If you flip it, it's Jerry Fialka. It's my nickname's Geritol Fialka Seltzer and Jeremy Folkways, and then it's just General Foods. It's like cereal box reading. And I have another one.
But flipping it is obviously what you need to do with McLuhan.
Yeah.
And ground, I don't know why he decided to do figure ground. I guess figure is what everybody else was doing, and he wanted ground. But you are coming at these questions from a ground standpoint.
Yeah.
Not from a figure standpoint.
Yeah.
So for Jerry Fialka, it should be flipped.
Yeah, it should be flipped, definitely. And I have another one, AM, like get up in the morning and, AM is anticipatory mindfulness. So it's twofold, because what you just said about you being able to, it's not predict the future, however you want to say it, to live in the future, you sort of said it, or is that similar to me saying anticipatory mindfulness? And also,
yes, I think so.
Throw in this. Martha Graham said, "Great artists aren't ahead of their times; they are their times."
Right.
So those two ideas. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, if the artist is the antenna of the race, that is the current subconscious of the race.
Yeah,
that's what artists of the sort that we're talking about here, and that McLuhan and Pound were talking about, and obviously there are many different. So, do you remember what television retrieves? What is the retrieval quadrant for television?
I should know, but tell me, please.
The occult.
The occult. Oh, yeah.
And that's for Pound.
And that's Pound. Wow. So, tell me someone, you've covered this a little. You want to go another half hour, or you want to stop now? I mean, we did 2 hours. We could do part 2 or 3 and keep them to 2 hours each, but it's up to you how you're feeling.
Why don't we come back and do another session?
Yeah.
And we'll start the other session with, and so what are you doing about this? Or
what are you doing about this? Yeah.
How does all this stuff enter into our lives, and
yeah, because I mean, literally, Mark, I've gotten to number 6 on my script, and I told you usually I get to 15 to 20 when I do a part 2, but it really has been enlightening, and I'm glad that you're articulate in stressing these percepts to me, succinctly, and form recognition now is going to stick with me. Form recognition, and
something that machines cannot be programmed to do.
Yeah. Well,
which is why ChatGPT is such a fun toy to play with.
It is the toy.
I feel like I'm 8 years old. In fact, I do have a photograph someplace of myself getting a robot as a Christmas present.
Yeah.
Probably about at the age of 8. So this would have been the late 50s, and it would have been something that sparked and had batteries in it, and
Yeah.
probably a wired remote control. So I'm playing with robots again and having a great time.
Yeah, it is quite amazing. Why don't we close out, because you are aware of the tetrad. I've been doing tetrads in group settings for 28 years.
Wow.
You know, where these people, the funny thing about the third step, you stressing the third step is well, we do not name them 1, 2, 3, 4, and I know you're not supposed to, but just to be linear. And I constantly say, well, the third step's the hardest, but you know, don't worry about this. Don't think, just go with your impulse and your guess. And if you really are stuck, just say everything humans invent retrieves the campfire or the watering hole, or you know, us doing a tetrad, you know. So I love that you stress that, because I know a big MEA person said they complained about what is this retrieval? What is an electric toothbrush retrieve? I mean, they literally dissed that. It's like, these are just playful questions. They're prompting.
So do you find the retrieval, where does it rank on the easy to difficult scale in the 28 years?
Well, I think in 28 years, the way my group has formed now that we're focused with a smaller group on Zoom, because we don't we're not live.
Public library, and
we don't do it in public libraries, and it's better because I have someone in Texas and I have someone in New York, and they couldn't come. So I always say we should be doing tetrads like the college debate club TV show. And like, you know, Andrew McLuhan has his group and I have my group, and then we do tetrads as like a competition. I says, we would blow these people away. And then when we do Marshalls, we go, that's lame. Ours is better. And some of our answers, these people have gotten it, refined it so well. I do get insights and feel happy that they're really utilizing these 4 questions to take things a little farther. So, you know, because of COVID, I switched everything over to Zoom. Right. You know, I do the, why don't we do just, you tell me the 4 questions for Zoom. What does Zoom enhance?
Well, Zoom obviously enhances meeting with people and talking with them. That is its primary activity, and what it obsoletes. You'd have to say it obsoletes writing letters to people. It obsoletes other sorts of formats for accomplishing these sorts of things, and you just, in fact, described it yourself. It obsoletes distances between people. It obsoletes. So this is the enhance and obsolete part of this, I guess, is the most obvious part of it. What does it retrieve? Well, if perfect memory is what computers retrieve, then the retrieval of Zoom is obviously you put it on YouTube.
That's it.
You put it someplace where it can be retrieved and archived and indexed and so forth. And so it's retrieving a medieval form of communications, disputations. There are a variety of ways that medievals talk to each other. And to be fair here, as you know very well, writing doesn't eliminate talking. These things accumulate. So Scribble drove the paradigm for a couple thousand years, but there's plenty of talking going on in the midst of that. But the retrieval of Zoom is I go to Zoom and there's a list of things, and I'm interested in a guy who's restoring a Lamborghini, and I'm interested in another guy who has takes oscilloscopes apart, and I'm interested in other songs that were done by this group that talks about how things are breaking down in the trailer park.
Right.
So I want to hear the other songs they've got. And so I can easily spend hours a day retrieving YouTubes. and so Zooms are treated that way, and very often wind up in these sort of retrieval situations. And the last quadrant, which I associate with, so this is obviously flip or reverse. What Zoom reverses into, in my experience, is it reverses into a face-to-face communication again.
Yeah.
Enhancing communication that is distant and odd. There's a lot about Jerry Fialka that I'm very curious about. And so the number of times that I've been in a Zoom where people say, okay, well, we got to figure out how we're going to get together now. We're going to figure out how we're going to do that. So the reversal is actually bringing us back to face-to-face communications. That'd be my 4 quadrants.
Super cool, Mark. That was so well done. I appreciate it. And just to close out, it's like what Eric wrote in the Lost Tetrads book, that tetrads are like a cross between poetry and hieroglyphics. In that, just tell me if this is kind of accurate, that we don't ask these questions for the intention of the inventor of the tetrad subject. It's not about the intention of it. It's about the hidden psychic effects and how it shapes our behavior. A
tetrad is like the Rorschach test, or like any number of psychological tests. It's a psychological test. I would only just note, however, and so it's an attempt to expose the subconscious. I would only suggest here, and I'm sure you know more about this than I do, that Eric McLuhan had a massive obsession about hieroglyphics and the Egyptians. So one of the books that has not yet been published, but Andrew is working on for his father, is Eric McLuhan's version of Egyptian art.
Oh, good. I didn't know.
He has written a book, and Andrew is just trying to find the time to bring it together. And it's quite fascinating. I have, I think, most of the book in chapter form that Eric had sent me for editorial suggestions and so forth. And so the world hasn't seen that yet. So hieroglyphics was Eric's story, not perhaps so much my own approach to this, but tetrads are absolutely an artistic subconscious expression. And that's why they were invented. And we've learned a great deal about a lot of people, and would learn more if they would dare. This is one of the reasons why so many people in the McLuhan world do not do tetrads.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to expose their subconscious.
Yeah.
Danger, Robinson, danger.
Danger. That's like to expose their subconscious. It's always like, oh, they're just questions to analyze media. And, now I'm going to add that, to expose your subconscious. It's fun. It really is.
It really is a version of dropping your pants.
It's dropping your pants. Because this fear of tetrads and Finnegan's Wake by McLuhanites is always intriguing. And I think it goes back to this study of Egypt is why did these people feel they had to put these things in the coffin and in the burial? Like this idea of archiving again and preserving. In your retrieval talk on a tetrad for Zoom was kind of, well, Zoom is live, but then you preserve it on YouTube. It's a preservation, you know. All right, Mark, thank you so much. It's been enlightening and I really appreciate it. And I'll send you some dates and we'll book a part 2. And we should do some salons with Doug and some other people and really get it, you know, the Hollywood Squares version.
If Doug is ready for that, a public discussion of that sort, I've had private discussions with Doug and other people, and yes, let's be clear. For the rest of the world, he is Douglas Ruskoff.
Douglas, thank you. Sorry, yeah.
I just happen to have known him for 30, 40 years, and so I used the old name before he converted.
His work is important. And Mark, I appreciate your work and everything you do. And thank you so much. Even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope our discussion will go on forever and ever.
Jerry, it's been such a pleasure to meet you and talk with you about this. I look forward to continuing the conversation on SteamYard or on YouTube or wherever it might be. Looking forward.
StreamYard, yeah. It's we have it's like stream and steam is it's the water, and it's like it's the figure ground continuing on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
See you before long. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.